My name is Ruby, and I am 31 years old. 5 years ago, I sat on a pristine white sofa in my in-laws' living room in Charlotte, North Carolina, and watched a man hand his daughter a fortune while he threw a pile of rusted nails at his son. That man was my father-in-law, Wallace. He called us there to divide a family real estate trust early. He slid a heavy linen folder across the glass coffee table toward my sister-in-law, Chelsea. Inside was the deed to a paid-off luxury penthouse in uptown Charlotte. Wallace smiled and swirled the scotch in his crystal glass. He told the room that Chelsea needed the right optics to secure high-end clients for her public relations firm. Then he picked up a thin and yellowed manila envelope. He tossed it onto the table toward my husband, Ian. Ian is a middle school history teacher. I am an agricultural botanist. We work for our paychecks. Inside Ian's envelope was the deed to a rotting off-grid cabin on 10 acres of overgrown brush up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The roof was caving in. The plumbing was dead. Wallace leaned back and looked at Ian with eyes that held zero warmth. "You have always lacked ambition, Ian. This property will teach you the value of sweat equity." It was not a gift. It was a punishment. Wallace was penalizing Ian for choosing a public school classroom over the family real estate firm. Beside me, Chelsea hid a smirk behind her manicured hand. I felt Ian physically shrink into the sofa cushions. He stared at the rug and accepted the insult just like he had his entire life. My blood burned. Before I tell you exactly how I took that rotting piece of wood and used it to corner Wallace at his own game, please take a second to like this video. But only do it if you have ever had to smile politely while someone tried to make you feel small. Welcome to Eva Tells Stories. Drop a comment to let me know your age and what city you are listening from today. Now let me take you back to that living room to the exact second my pride laid a trap for my own marriage. We should have stood up. We should have left that yellow envelope sitting on the glass table and walked out the front door. But pride is a terrible blinder. I looked at Wallace and his smug face. I looked at Sylvia, my mother-in-law, who was busy adjusting her watch and pretending this division of assets was perfectly normal. I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to take their trash and forge it into a weapon. I reached out and took the envelope. That was my first mistake. The drive back from Charlotte to our rented apartment was silent. Ian kept both hands gripped on the steering wheel while rain washed down the windshield. The radio stayed off. In my purse, I carried the thin yellow envelope containing the deed to the cabin. Every time we hit a bump in the road, the paper seemed to rustle against the leather of my bag. It felt heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. We had just watched his sister Chelsea receive a pristine piece of downtown real estate while we were handed a rotting liability. I was angry. My pride was burning a hole right through my common sense. I wanted to turn the car around and throw the envelope through Wallace's front window. Ian just kept his eyes on the road. He was used to this. He had spent his entire life shrinking to fit the small spaces his father assigned to him. I had only been married to Ian for 3 years. I thought I knew how to handle his family. I thought my determination was stronger than their money. That pride led directly to my first major mistake. When we finally unlocked the door to our small apartment, we sat down at the cheap laminate kitchen table. We did not even take off our coats. Ian slid the deed out of the envelope. The paper was stiff and covered in dense legal jargon. He read it once. He read it a second time. I watched his shoulders drop. He pushed the document across the table and pointed to a paragraph buried near the bottom of the second page. It was a reversion clause. The text was deliberately vague. It stated that the property must be maintained to reasonable family investment standards within a period of 60 months. If those undefined standards were not met, the trust held the right to reclaim the deed in full. I stared at the words. I asked Ian what reasonable family investment standards meant. Ian let out a bitter laugh. He rubbed his eyes and looked at me with a face full of exhaustion. "It means whatever my father wants it to mean," Ian said. His voice was tight with anxiety. "Ruby, this is a trap. He knows we do not have the capital to renovate a property in the mountains. He expects us to try. He expects us to drain our bank accounts fixing the plumbing and the roof. Then in 5 years, he will drive up the mountain, look at our work, and decide it does not meet his standard. He will file the paperwork to take it back. He just wants to watch us fail and take it back." Ian knew his father better than I did. He tried to explain the psychology of a man who viewed his own children as assets to be managed. Wallace did not give gifts. He distributed leverage. Ian told me we should mail the deed back the next morning. He said we should walk away and focus on buying our own small house in the suburbs. He wanted peace. He wanted to be free of the constant invisible strings his family attached to every interaction. I should have listened to him. He was offering us a clean break. But I was so blinded by the desire to turn that insult into a victory that I ignored his warnings. I refused to let Wallace win. I opened my laptop right there at the kitchen table. I am an agricultural botanist. I spend my days analyzing soil composition and thermal gradients. I pulled up the county topographical maps for the specific parcel of land in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I ordered satellite soil data and historical weather patterns for the exact elevation. Ian watched me type. He asked me what I was doing. I told him I was looking at our future. The cabin itself was garbage. It was a liability. But the dirt underneath it was remarkable. The 10 acres sat on a unique elevation with a dense hardwood canopy. The slope faced the perfect direction to limit direct afternoon sun while maintaining optimal moisture retention. The soil was rich in decaying organic matter and highly acidic loam. To a real estate developer, it was just steep, unusable brush. To a botanist, it was a gold mine. I looked at Ian and I laid out a vision. I told him the land was a perfect microclimate for cultivating rare native strains of Appalachian ginseng and specialized culinary truffles. These were high-value crops that required very little flat acreage but demanded exact soil conditions. We had those exact conditions. I arrogantly dismissed his fears about the reversion clause. I convinced myself that my science could outsmart his father's contract. I told Ian that if we generated actual commercial value from the land, Wallace would have no legal standing to claim we failed to meet his investment standards. We would redefine the standard. Ian resisted. We argued for hours. He reminded me of the cost. We had $42,000 in our joint savings account. It took us 5 years of relentless budgeting to save that money. It came from him grading papers until midnight and me working extra hours in the university lab. It was supposed to be our down payment for a safe, boring house in a safe, boring neighborhood. I pushed him. I used his own desire for independence to manipulate him. I asked him if he wanted to spend the rest of his life letting his father dictate his worth. I told him this was our chance to build something they could never take credit for. I weaponized his pain to fuel my pride. Eventually, he gave in. He nodded his head and agreed to the plan. I won the argument. I felt victorious in that moment. I did not realize I was steering us directly into a financial nightmare. We drained our entire combined savings into that broken property. We had to make the cabin habitable while preserving the delicate ecosystem of the surrounding woods. I wrote a check for $12,000 to a specialized crew just to jack up the sagging foundation and stabilize the floor joists. I wrote another check for $8,000 to strip and seal the rotting roof before the autumn rains set in. We spent $10,000 on localized water filtration systems and solar power arrays because the property was entirely off the grid. The remaining money went directly into the dirt. We bought specialized shade tarps. We purchased highly sensitive spores and rootstock. Every single dollar we had in the world evaporated into that mountain. I watched our bank balance drop from $42,000 to $30,000, then to $10,000, then to a few $100s. The fear started to creep in, but I pushed it down with sheer stubbornness. I tied our financial survival to a deed we did not fully control. I convinced myself that our exhaustion and our commitment would act as a shield against any legal manipulation. I thought hard work was the ultimate protection. I believed that if we just worked until our hands bled, we would be safe. I was profoundly wrong. I was playing by the rules of biology. I trusted the soil and the rain and the seasons. But Wallace was playing a long game of contractual leverage. He did not care about the soil. He cared about the fine print. We moved into the cabin in late October. We had zero safety net left. We had a patched roof, a cold floor, and 10 acres of seeds sleeping in the dirt. We had no money for emergencies. We had no extra funds for heat. I thought the worst part was over because the renovations were done. I did not realize the true cost of my arrogance was just beginning. The mountain was about to teach us a lesson in survival. The romantic idea of living off the land is a luxury reserved for people who have a safety net. For us, the first 2 years on that mountain stripped away every illusion we held about resilience. Television shows often portray property renovations as a brisk montage set to upbeat music. You see a few paint splatters on a smiling face, and then a magical reveal. Our reality was nothing like a broadcast. It was grueling and bone-deep exhaustion. Winter in the Blue Ridge Mountains is an unforgiving force. The wind does not just blow through the trees. It searches for every gap in your walls and settles into your joints. We had patched the roof and stabilized the floor, but the insulation was decades old. The cold became a third resident in our home. Our plumbing failed 3 separate times during that first January. The temperature dropped below 0 for a week straight. The ancient pipes hidden beneath the floorboards froze solid. Thawing them required crawling on frozen dirt under the house with a handheld propane heater praying the copper would not burst. When the third freeze happened, the pipes finally cracked. We spent 4 days melting snow on a portable camping stove just to have drinking water. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor, wrapped in a heavy sleeping bag, crying into my hands because I was too tired to stand up. I felt the burden of my own arrogance pressing down on me. I had dragged us into this frozen box to satisfy my pride. Ian bore the brunt of our financial ruin. He woke up in the dark every single morning at 5. He layered his clothing and drove his battered sedan an hour down the steep, winding roads to the middle school where he taught history. But his teacher salary was not enough to keep us alive. The off-grid heating oil we required to run the main furnace cost hundreds of dollars a month. To cover that expense, Ian took on private tutoring sessions in the wealthy suburbs of Asheville. He taught privileged kids how to write essays while his own hands were cracked from chopping firewood. He would drag himself through the cabin door at 9 o'clock every night. He looked hollow. He was dead on his feet, dropping his bag by the door and staring at the wall. I would heat up whatever cheap meal we could afford, and we would eat in near silence. The physical toll on his body was obvious. He lost weight. Dark circles settled permanently under his eyes. The vibrant, energetic man I married was being slowly crushed under the demands of basic survival. My burden was different, but equally heavy. I was responsible for the soil. The rare Appalachian ginseng and the culinary truffles I planned to cultivate were highly sensitive. They required precise light filtration and specific mineral balances in the dirt. As spring approached, the window for planting was closing. We needed specialized organic fertilizer and heavy-duty shade tarps to protect the vulnerable rootstock from early sunburn. We had $0 in our checking account. The credit cards were declined. I opened my jewelry box and took out the only valuable item I owned. It was a vintage gold watch my grandmother left me before she died. She wore it every day of her life. It held immense sentimental value. I drove down the mountain to a jeweler in the city and placed it on a glass counter. The man behind the register offered me a fraction of its true worth. I did not negotiate. I took the cash, drove straight to an agricultural supply store, and bought the tarps and the nutrients. Driving home with a trunk full of farming supplies, I felt a sharp ache in my chest. I traded a piece of my heritage for a gamble in the dirt. That level of sustained stress acts like acid on a relationship. It began fracturing our marriage in subtle, quiet ways. We stopped having conversations about the future and only talked about immediate threats, how much oil was left, which bill could be delayed. Resentment took root in the spaces where affection used to be. I would look down at my hands. They were covered in blisters and ingrained with permanent soil stains. My fingernails were cracked. My back ached from digging trenches. In my darkest moments, I blamed Ian. I resented his lifelong passive acceptance of his family and their disdain. If he had just stood up to Wallace years ago, we would never have been handed this broken property as a punishment. I blamed him for lacking the spine to demand respect. Ian carried his own quiet anger. He resented me for forcing this issue. He felt he was freezing and working himself into an early grave simply to satisfy my need to prove a point to a man he already knew was cruel. He thought my pride was destroying our lives. One night, after a particularly brutal argument about a past-due electricity bill, Ian slept in his car just to avoid being in the same room as me. We were fighting the elements, the mountain, and each other. The isolation was bad, but the outside interference was worse. Sylvia had a habit of calling at the exact moments when our morale was lowest. My mother-in-law never called to ask how we were managing. She used her phone calls to conduct psychological warfare. Her voice always sounded perfectly modulated and dripping with fake concern. She would start by detailing the luxurious events happening in Charlotte. "Chelsea is hosting a charity gala tonight," Sylvia would brag, letting the words hang in the air. "She just bought a stunning new dress, and the caterers are setting up in her penthouse right now." Then she would let a brief pause settle before slipping the knife in deep. "Is your little shack still standing out there in the woods?" I would grip the phone while my breath plumed in the freezing kitchen air. I told her we were fine. I kept my tone neutral, refusing to give her the satisfaction of hearing me shiver. She knew we were suffering. She enjoyed it. The family considered our poverty a spectator sport. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. They only visited this mountain once during those first 2 years. It was late March, and the ground was thick with thawing mud. A pristine luxury vehicle crunched up our gravel driveway. Wallace and Sylvia did not bring housewarming gifts. They did not come to share a meal. They drove 2 hours just to inspect the damage. Wallace stepped out of the driver's seat. He wore tailored slacks and expensive leather shoes. He looked at the sagging porch. He looked at the tarp-covered slopes where I had spent hundreds of hours preparing the soil. He did not ask about the crops. He looked down at my boots, which were caked in thick brown clay. A sneer formed on his face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He did not even cross the threshold into our home. He stood by his vehicle, crossed his arms, and looked at Ian. He told my husband that the offer to join the real estate firm was still open, provided Ian was ready to apologize for this foolish detour. They wanted us to fail. They wanted the cold and the poverty to break our spirits. They wanted Ian to crawl back to Charlotte defeated and compliant, ready to be the obedient subordinate son for the rest of his life. Wallace got back into his seat and drove away, leaving us standing in the mud. He thought the dirt on my boots was a sign of surrender. He saw the peeling paint on the cabin and assumed we were beaten. He measured success in square footage and luxury brands. He did not understand the quiet, invisible process happening beneath the surface of the earth. They severely underestimated the real-world grit we were cultivating. The cold had nearly broken us, but it had also forced our roots deep into the ground. My background in agricultural botany was never just a piece of paper hanging on a wall. It was the lens through which I decoded the world. When Wallace looked at the 10 acres surrounding our sagging cabin, he saw unusable terrain. He saw a steep incline choked with weeds and dense shadows. I saw a delicate, intricate biological engine. I had not drained our life savings just to patch a leaky roof and shiver in the dark. I tied our survival to that specific mountain because the cabin sat on a highly specific microclimate. The property featured a perfect shaded slope facing northeast, holding rich loamy soil that retained moisture without ever becoming waterlogged. The dense hardwood canopy filtered the sunlight into a precise dappled pattern. To a real estate developer, it was a barren liability. To me, it was a natural incubator. I did not want to grow common vegetables. You cannot build security selling tomatoes at a local farmer market when you are thousands of dollars in debt. I targeted high-value specialty crops that required exact biological conditions. I focused my efforts on cultivating a rare native strain of Appalachian ginseng alongside specialized culinary truffles. Truffles require inoculating the root systems of specific host trees with fungal spores and waiting for years. Ginseng demands a pristine, undisturbed forest floor and intense patience. Both crops are notoriously difficult to cultivate outside their wild habitats. The science had to be flawless. I spent 18 months running failed trials. I adjusted soil acidity. I monitored thermal gradients. I tested localized nutrient applications. It was a slow, punishing process of trial and error played out in the dirt while our bank account drained to zero. Success in agriculture is never an overnight magic trick. It is usually preceded by a disaster. Our disaster struck in late April of our second year. We had a freak late frost. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees below the seasonal average without warning. I woke up at 3 in the morning, ran outside with a flashlight, and saw ice crystals forming on the protective netting. I spent 4 hours frantically trying to insulate the delicate ginseng shoots with pine straw and thermal blankets, but the cold was too fast. I lost half my first crop before the sun even came up. That frost cost us thousands of dollars we simply did not have. It represented months of grueling physical labor wiped out in a single morning. I knelt in the frozen dirt and stared at the blackened, wilted leaves. I felt a profound, sickening failure settling into my chest. That loss brought Ian and me to our breaking point. The tension erupted later that week in our gravel driveway. Ian had just checked the mail. He was holding a credit card statement. The card was maxed out. We had no available credit to buy groceries, let alone replace the damaged rootstock. We stood next to his rusted sedan and had a screaming match that echoed through the empty woods. Ian waved the paper in the air. His voice cracked with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He asked me how much more we had to lose before I admitted defeat. He told me his father was right. He said we were drowning for a science experiment that was never going to work. I yelled back. I told him the science was sound, and the weather was a variable no one could control. I begged him to give me one more season. I watched the man I loved stand in the cold rain looking like he wanted to surrender. He wanted to call his father and ask for a lifeline. I stood in front of him and asked him to trust the dirt instead of the man who gave it to us. He did not say a word. He just turned around and walked back into the cabin. But he did not make the phone call. We survived that summer on rice beans and sheer stubbornness. I salvaged the remaining half of the crop. I nurtured those surviving plants with an obsessive focus. By year 3, the biological scales finally tipped in our favor. The yield stabilized. The ginseng roots grew thick and deeply ridged, indicating exceptional wild simulated quality. Deep under the host trees, my inoculated spores finally produced dense, fragrant truffles. Digging up that first viable harvest felt like unearthing a miracle. The smell of the damp earth mixed with the sharp, rich scent of the truffles was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. It was the scent of our salvation. I packed a small wooden crate with our best samples. I put on my only clean blazer, leaving my mud-stained boots in the car. I drove into downtown Asheville. Asheville is a city known for its elite culinary scene and farm-to-table culture. I did not aim for standard grocery suppliers. I walked directly into the kitchens of 2 Michelin-starred restaurants. I asked the executive chefs to slice my truffles and examine the age rings on my ginseng. They recognized the quality immediately. The flavor profiles were intense and hyper-local. I secured a modest, hard-won contract with both establishments. They agreed to purchase our entire seasonal yield at a premium market rate. The income was not flashy penthouse money. It would not buy us luxury cars or designer clothes. But it was steady. It was sustainable. Most importantly, it was growing. We finally had breathing room. With actual revenue flowing in, we took a crucial administrative step. I sat down with Ian and suggested we form an LLC to manage the business. Because the agricultural science and the labor were my domain, we quietly tied the operations to my name. We kept the business entity entirely separate from the physical property deed held by Wallace. We did not know how vital that legal separation would become, but my instinct told me to build a wall around our income. Ian signed the operating agreement without hesitation. He recognized that the harvest belonged to the science, not the real estate. As our bank account slowly recovered, we made a strategic choice. We kept our heads down. We did not boast on social media. We did not post pictures of our restaurant contracts or our beautiful harvest crates. When Sylvia called to brag about Chelsea taking clients to expensive dinners, I just listened. When she asked how we were surviving, I kept my tone flat and told her we were managing. We let Wallace and Sylvia continue believing we were starving in the woods. We let them think Ian was still grading papers until midnight, just to keep the lights on. Silence is the most effective perimeter you can build around your peace. Letting your enemies underestimate you gives you the ultimate tactical advantage. While my in-laws spent their energy projecting wealth to the world, we were quietly carving out genuine security in the shadows. But maintaining a fake image requires a constant flow of cash. And down in the city, the golden child was quietly running out of borrowed time. Real security is quiet. It grows deep underground where no one can see it. Fake security is loud and requires constant, exhausting maintenance. While Ian and I spent our 4th year quietly building equity in the soil, my sister-in-law was desperately trying to keep her world from fracturing. From the outside, Chelsea was the flawless picture of the Charlotte elite. She was a public relations executive who wore designer labels and dined at exclusive restaurants. Her identity was entirely dependent on projecting an image of endless prosperity. Her parents had raised her to believe that optics were the only currency that mattered. We saw the cracks in her performance during our annual obligation to attend Thanksgiving dinner. November in the mountains is a busy time for us as we prepare the beds for winter dormancy, but Ian felt a residual duty to show up for the holiday. We locked the cabin and made the long drive down the winding roads into the sprawling suburbs. Walking into Wallace and Sylvia Pristine House always felt like stepping into a museum where nothing was allowed to live or breathe. The air smelled of expensive chemical room sprays and roasted meat. When we sat down at the long mahogany dining table, Chelsea arrived late. She wore a tailored silk dress and carried a bottle of imported wine. She kissed her parents on the cheek and offered Ian a tight, obligatory smile. A year ago, I would have felt intimidated by her polished exterior. But spending years nursing fragile plants back to health teaches you how to look for hidden signs of blight. I noticed the tight lines around her mouth. I saw the way her eyes constantly darted around the room like she was searching for an escape route. Her energy was brittle. The conversation followed the usual predictable script. Sylvia dominated the room with stories about her country club friends and their luxury vacations. Wallace steered the topic toward commercial interest rates and his golf handicap. Ian and I ate in silence. We were accustomed to being the ignored guests at their table. Halfway through the main course, Chelsea reached for her wine glass. She picked up the heavy bottle to pour herself another serving. Her hand was shaking so badly that the neck of the bottle clinked sharply against the crystal rim. 2 drops of red wine spilled onto the immaculate white tablecloth. The stain spread like a warning signal. Sylvia stopped talking mid-sentence and stared at the red spot. Chelsea quickly grabbed a napkin and dabbed at the spill. She let out a forced, high-pitched laugh. She blamed the tremor on too much caffeine and a stressful week at the office. She casually mentioned there was a minor restructuring happening at her public relations firm. She used corporate jargon to smooth over the tension. She talked about optimizing client portfolios and streamlining vendor accounts. It sounded professional to a casual listener, but the pitch of her voice was entirely wrong. It was the sound of someone treading water. Sylvia quickly jumped in to change the subject and protect her daughter from scrutiny. She began complaining loudly about the homeowner association fees at Chelsea downtown building. Sylvia sighed dramatically and said the board had doubled the monthly dues without warning. She waved her hand and dismissed it as a frustrating investment expense that successful people simply had to endure. I looked at Ian. He caught my eye across the table. We both understood the subtext. The truth was hiding right behind Sylvia's defensive excuses and Chelsea shaking hands. Chelsea was drowning. She had been gifted a penthouse that was entirely paid off. It was a clean asset with 0 debt attached to it when Wallace handed her the deed. But living a life built on pure image is an expensive habit. To keep up with her wealthy clients and maintain her elite social standing, Chelsea had leveraged that free and clear property. She had taken out a series of high-interest personal loans, using the penthouse as collateral. She was using borrowed money to buy expensive clothes, host lavish dinners, and lease a luxury vehicle she could not actually afford. She was burning through cash to fake a lifestyle she had not earned. The restructuring at her firm was not a minor inconvenience. It was a threat to her fragile cash flow. I received confirmation of her desperate situation 20 minutes later. I excused myself from the table to use the restroom down the hall. As I walked past Wallace's home office, I heard hushed, urgent voices. The door was slightly ajar. I stopped and listened. Chelsea was standing near the window with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Wallace was sitting at his heavy oak desk holding a pen. He did not look angry. He looked trapped. Chelsea was telling him that the bank was threatening to initiate penalty proceedings if she missed another payment cycle. She said her credit score was taking a hit and it could jeopardize her professional licenses. Wallace opened his leather checkbook. I watched him write a check, hand it to his daughter, and tell her she needed to rein in her spending. He warned her that the commercial real estate market was slow and his own liquidity was tied up in properties that were not selling. They were bleeding their own cash reserves to prop up the golden child. Wallace and Sylvia were sacrificing their financial stability to protect the illusion they had created. I walked back to the dining room and sat down next to my husband. I looked at Ian. He was wearing a faded wool sweater he had owned for 3 years. His hands bore the faint, permanent calluses of a man who splits his own firewood. His parents ignored him while they discussed the merits of upgrading a car lease. Ian sat there calmly eating his dinner. He did not look ashamed of his old sweater. He did not shrink into his chair. He possessed a quiet, steady strength that his family could not perceive. He did not say a word about the expanding contracts we held with the Michelin-starred restaurants in Asheville. He did not mention that just 3 days ago a specialized pharmaceutical buyer had contacted our business to inquire about purchasing our high-grade medicinal ginseng for organic supplements. We held a secret that changed the entire dynamic of that room. We had real, tangible value growing in the dirt. His family had nothing but debt and anxiety dressed up in expensive suits. Ian realized he did not need their approval anymore. The need for their validation had burned away during those freezing nights on the mountain. His silence was no longer a sign of submission. His silence was armor. We ate the dry turkey and the over-seasoned side dishes. We excused ourselves the moment dessert was finished, citing the long drive ahead of us. Sylvia gave us a tight wave from the sofa. Wallace nodded without making eye contact. Chelsea was already staring at her phone screen, typing frantically. We walked out into the cool November air and got into our car. Driving back toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, the contrast between our two worlds became absolute. They were rich on paper, but they were suffocating in reality. They were trapped in a prison made of unpaid bills and social expectations. We were cash poor, but we were free. We were carving out our own quiet sanctuary far away from their toxic expectations. But a financial hemorrhage cannot be cured with a single check. Wallace had placed a temporary patch over a gaping wound. The loans Chelsea held were compounding every single day. The debt was growing faster than her father could cover it. The illusion was running out of borrowed time. 6 months later, the fragile facade would shatter, leaving Wallace desperate for a lifeline. And a desperate man will always try to harvest what he has not sown. It took exactly 6 months for the structural integrity of Chelsea's life to fail. Spring arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, bringing a thaw to the frozen ground and green shoots to our carefully tended terraces. Down in the city, the thaw brought ruin. The public relations firm did not go through a minor restructuring. That was a convenient fiction spun over dry turkey to save face. The truth leaked out through the quiet, reliable channels of local industry gossip and eventually reached us. Chelsea was fired. She was not laid off. She was terminated for gross financial mismanagement. She had been expensing personal luxury purchases to corporate client accounts to fund her lavish lifestyle. The firm chose to let her go quietly to avoid a public scandal rather than press formal charges. But the termination severed her only source of real income. She lost the paycheck that kept the illusion afloat. Without that inflated monthly salary, the elaborate house of cards collapsed. The high-interest personal loans tied to her downtown penthouse went into default. The bank sent the warning notices. The grace periods expired. Foreclosure was no longer a vague threat hanging in the distant future. It was a formal legal process marching directly to her front door. The elite social standing she had purchased with borrowed money was about to be repossessed by the bank. She was facing public humiliation in a social circle that fed on failure. We were in the kitchen sorting seed packets for the upcoming planting cycle when Ian's phone rang. It was a Tuesday evening. The caller ID displayed his father's name. Ian stared at the glowing screen for a long moment before answering. I stood by the sink and watched his posture change. Even after 4 years of building his own independence, the reflex to brace for impact was still hardwired into his muscles. I could hear Wallace through the receiver. His voice lacked its usual polished, confident resonance. There was a raw, frayed edge to his tone. It was unvarnished panic. But Wallace did not know how to ask for help. A man who has spent his entire life issuing commands and writing checks does not know how to plead. Instead, he framed the crisis as a mandatory family obligation. "Your sister is in a bind," Wallace stated. He skipped any greeting or pleasantries. He laid out the situation using sterilized corporate terms. He called the impending foreclosure a temporary liquidity issue. He demanded that Ian step up and act like a supportive brother. He expected Ian to reach into whatever meager savings we possessed and wire a substantial sum to stall the bank's collection department. He spoke as if Ian owed this debt simply by being born into the family tree. He assumed our years of silence meant we had been hoarding cash. Ian leaned against the kitchen counter. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue or point out the hypocrisy of the request. He did not mention the decades of neglect. He just spoke the plain, unvarnished truth. "We do not have liquid cash to bail her out," Ian said. His tone was remarkably steady. "Every dollar we generate goes back into the soil and the business operations. There is nothing to wire you." The silence that followed on the line was thick and venomous. It was the sound of a bully hitting an unexpected wall. Wallace did not scream. He let out a sharp, exhaled breath. He muttered a short, bitter sentence about Ian always being a disappointment. Then he hung up. The line went dead with a hollow click. Ian lowered the phone. His hand was shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. We stood in the kitchen processing the reality of that brief phone call. Wallace was a man who prided himself on solving every problem with his wealth. If he was calling his estranged son demanding money, it meant his own resources were depleted. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind. Wallace and Sylvia were over-leveraged themselves. Their entire net worth was tied up in a portfolio of aging commercial strip malls that sat vacant on the outskirts of the city. The market for brick-and-mortar retail had shifted, leaving them holding properties that generated no rental income but still required heavy property tax payments and maintenance fees. They were asset-rich on paper, but dangerously cash-poor in practice. They simply did not have the liquid funds to rescue Chelsea this time. They could not write a check to make the problem vanish. They needed a sacrificial lamb. They needed an asset they could seize and sell quickly to pay off the bank and save their daughter from the ultimate humiliation of a public foreclosure. The Charlotte social circle is ruthless, and Sylvia would rather lose a limb than face her country club friends if Chelsea lost her luxury penthouse. They were desperate men cornered by their own financial vanity. Ian set his phone down on the wooden table. All the color had drained from his face. He looked out the window at the fading evening light catching the tops of the trees. He turned to me, and the realization dawned in his eyes. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. The sudden clarity made the air in the room feel thin. "They were not calling for our money, Ruby," he whispered. His voice was hollow. "They know a middle school teacher does not have tens of thousands of dollars sitting in a checking account. They were testing the waters." I dried my hands on a towel. "What do you mean?" I asked. Ian walked over to the metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out the heavy linen folder containing the original property transfer documents, the same folder his father had tossed across the glass coffee table years ago. He laid the stiff yellowed paper on the kitchen table and pointed to the date stamped at the top right corner. "It was late April, the 5-year mark," he said. "We signed this deed nearly 5 years ago." I stared at the date. The vague reversion clause buried at the bottom of the document stated the property must be maintained to family investment standards within 60 months. If the undefined standard was not met, Wallace could legally reclaim the land without compensating us for our improvements. The deadline was fast approaching. We had mere weeks left before the contractual window closed forever. Wallace was not calling to beg for a loan. He was calling to gauge our vulnerability. He was probing our defenses to see if we had the resources to fight a protracted legal battle. When Ian admitted we had no liquid cash, he gave his father the exact intelligence he needed. Wallace now knew we could not afford to hire an expensive real estate attorney to defend our claim. They needed a property to liquidate. Our cabin was sitting on 10 acres of pristine mountain land. 4 years ago, it was a worthless patch of brush and rotting timber. But today, thanks to my localized soil testing my sweat and our agricultural infrastructure, the land was primed. The dirt was valuable. The specialized irrigation, the cleared terraces, and the rich, loamy soil made the acreage a prime target for a boutique developer. Wallace did not care about the house. He wanted the dirt beneath it. The panic in Wallace's voice was not just about Chelsea. It was the frantic energy of a man looking for a loophole. He realized he held the legal mechanism to steal our life work and use it to erase his daughter's debt. He just needed a justification to pull the trigger. He needed to prove we had violated the obscure terms of the trust document. I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. We had spent years pouring our energy, our tears, and our youth into this soil. We had finally reached a point of stability. We had contracts with high-end restaurants. We had a quiet, safe life. And now the man who handed us a rotting cabin as a joke was preparing to snatch it back the moment it showed real commercial value. Ian looked at the paperwork. He looked at my rough, calloused hands. He knew what was coming next. The phone call was just the opening maneuver in a hostile takeover. Wallace was going to find a way to break the deed. The quiet sanctuary we built was about to become a legal battlefield. The clock was ticking down to the anniversary, and the predator was already on his way up the mountain. We did not have to wait long. The ambush happened on a Tuesday. It was early in the morning when the mountain air was still thick with damp fog. We were in the middle of our spring harvest rotation. A specialized refrigerated delivery truck from a high-end Asheville distributor was parked near the lower terraces. The driver was busy loading wooden crates filled with our carefully cultivated culinary truffles. I had just handed him a signed purchase invoice on a clipboard. It was a tangible display of our hard-won success. The business was operating smoothly. Then the peace broke. A sleek, black luxury SUV turned off the main county road and crunched up our steep dirt driveway. The vehicle did not belong in these woods. It was a machine built for pristine suburban asphalt. It came to a halt right next to my drying sheds. I watched through the kitchen window as the driver door opened. Wallace stepped out. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and polished leather shoes. He did not look toward the cabin. He did not walk up the front steps to knock on the door like a normal guest. He treated the property as if he already held the master key. He bypassed our home entirely and marched straight toward the terrace slopes out back. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stood frozen by the sink. Ian stepped up beside me. We watched his father conduct a silent, predatory audit. Wallace surveyed the land with cold, calculating eyes. He looked at the automated drip irrigation lines running seamlessly along the contours of the hill. He inspected the heavy-duty protective netting shielding the delicate ginseng shoots. He paused to watch the Asheville distributor secure the cargo doors of the delivery truck and pull away down the gravel road. Wallace did not see my calloused hands. He did not care about the sleepless nights Ian spent grading papers in the freezing dark to fund those irrigation pipes. He did not see the years of physical pain required to turn dead brush into yielding soil. He only saw numbers. He saw a working commercial infrastructure. He saw a sudden, unexpected lifeline for his drowning daughter. He finished his inspection. He turned around and walked purposefully toward the back entrance of our cabin. He pulled open the screen door without knocking. Wallace walked right into our kitchen. He did not bother to wipe his shoes on the mat. He tracked clumps of damp mountain clay across the hardwood floor Ian and I had sanded and refinished by hand. He carried a thick leather portfolio under his arm. He stood in the center of our small kitchen and let the scent of his expensive cologne fill the space. It felt like a home invasion. It was a hostile takeover occurring right next to our stove. He unzipped the portfolio and pulled out a heavy legal folder. He dropped it flat on our kitchen table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was sharp and loud. "You have done well out here, Ian," he said. His voice was smooth and dripping with condescension. It was the tone of a supervisor praising an intern for finishing a menial task. He placed both hands on the back of a kitchen chair and leaned forward. "The land has real commercial value now. It is producing a steady yield. That makes things much simpler for all of us." Ian stared at him. My husband looked paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the intrusion. All the strength Ian had built over the last 4 years seemed to drain out of him the moment his father crossed the threshold. The old childhood conditioning took over. Ian could not speak. His posture crumbled under the weight of his father's gaze. Wallace did not wait for a response. He treated our silence as submission. He laid out his plan as if it were a foregone conclusion. "Chelsea is moving in," Wallace announced. His gaze swept around our small living space, taking inventory of the walls. "We are liquidating your business assets to cover her defaulted loans. The infrastructure you built outside will sell for a premium to the right buyer. The proceeds will clear her debt and save her credit. She will use the cabin as a quiet retreat while she figures out her next career move." The words hung in the air. He was casually discussing the dismantling of my entire life. He planned to tear down my business, sell my crops, and hand my sanctuary over to a woman who had never worked a day in the dirt. He wanted to use my sweat to erase her financial sins. I felt a hot, bright rage ignite in my chest. It burned away any lingering desire to be polite. I stepped in front of Ian, placing myself directly between my husband and his father. "This is our home," I said. My voice was shaking, but not from fear. It was vibrating with pure anger. "You cannot just walk in here and announce you are stealing our business to pay for your daughter's mistakes. We built this. You gave us a rotting shell and we turned it into a livelihood." Wallace turned to look at me. His eyes were dead. There was no empathy and no paternal warmth. There was only the cold pragmatism of a man who held a winning hand in a high-stakes game. "Read the deed, Ruby," he said. His tone dropped, lowering into a dangerous, quiet register. "The transfer documents you signed 5 years ago possess a very specific reversion clause. The property reverts to the family trust if our investment standards are not met." I glared at him. "We improved the property I shot back. We increased its value tenfold. You have no legal basis to claim we degraded the investment." Wallace offered a thin, humorless smile. "It is not about degradation," he countered. "It is about zoning. This parcel was deeded to you for residential use. I have decided your little farming experiment violates the residential zoning intent of the original trust. Running a commercial agricultural enterprise with heavy delivery trucks and industrial irrigation on family land is a breach of the contract. You altered the fundamental nature of the asset without trust approval." He tapped a single polished fingernail against the legal folder resting on the table. "It is a clear contractual breach," Wallace continued. "I have the paperwork ready to file. You have 3 days to sign the deed over to Chelsea quietly. If you cooperate, I will let you pack your personal belongings and walk away without a fuss. If you fight me, I will freeze your accounts, file an injunction against your little farm, and bury you in litigation until you are bankrupt." The threat was not a bluff. It was a promise backed by generational wealth. He knew we had no liquid capital to hire a defense attorney. He knew our entire net worth was planted in the soil outside the window. He was a seasoned predator who knew exactly how to corner his prey. I looked at the folder on the table. It contained the legal mechanics of our destruction. Wallace had found his loophole. He was using my own success against me. By turning the land into a profitable business, I had unwittingly triggered the very clause he needed to snatch it back. He did not view us as human beings. He viewed us as unpaid contractors who had unwittingly prepared a valuable asset for his favorite child. We had done all the heavy lifting, and now the landlord was here to collect the keys. Wallace turned around and walked back out the screen door. He walked across the porch, down the steps, and got into his luxury vehicle. He started the engine and drove down the mountain, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. The silence left behind in the kitchen was suffocating. The air felt thin and hard to breathe. I turned to look at my husband, expecting to see righteous anger. I expected to see Ian ready to fight tooth and nail for the life we had built. But as I looked at his face, I saw something that terrified me far more than Wallace and his legal threats. I saw a man who was already waving a white flag. The ultimatum hung in the air of our small kitchen like smoke from an extinguished fire. 3 days, 72 hours to sign away everything we owned. Just before Wallace had turned his back to walk out the screen door, he had paused. He looked at Ian using a tone perfected through decades of psychological conditioning. "Be a good brother, Ian," he had said. The words were quiet and laden with a chilling paternal authority. "Do not make me destroy you over dirt." Then he was gone, leaving the threat to rot the foundation of our safety. When the sound of his engine faded down the mountain road, the cabin felt suffocating. The log walls that had protected us from winter storms now felt like the interior of a cage. I looked down at the heavy legal folder resting on our refinished table. It was a tangible manifestation of ruin. Wallace was not bluffing. He possessed the capital to keep us locked in a courtroom until we starved. The legal system does not always favor the righteous. It favors the party who can afford to pay hourly retainer fees until the opposition runs out of oxygen. We had no oxygen left to burn. Our wealth was entirely buried in the soil outside the window. I turned to Ian. The adrenaline was still humming through my veins. I expected to see him mirroring my outrage. I wanted to see him clench his fists. I needed a partner ready to draw a line in the sand and defend the sanctuary we had bled to build. Instead, I looked at my husband and saw a man breaking under the weight of his lifelong submission. Ian was staring at the floorboards. His shoulders were slumped forward. All the quiet, steady strength I admired in him had evaporated. He looked like the little boy who grew up in that immaculate Charlotte house, learning that compliance was the only currency his parents accepted. Ian spent his childhood watching Chelsea receive rewards for performing while he received cold, calculated isolation whenever he expressed an independent thought. He became a middle school history teacher because he wanted a quiet, predictable life far away from high-stakes negotiations. But running away from a predator does not teach you how to fight one. It only teaches you how to hide. Now there was nowhere left to hide. "Maybe we just sign it over," Ian whispered. He did not look up when he said it. The words barely carried over the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator. I froze. I thought I had misunderstood him. I asked him to repeat himself. Ian finally lifted his head. His eyes were red and swimming with a desperate, exhausting panic. "We can start over, Ruby," he pleaded. His voice cracked. "We can pack our things tonight. We can find a cheap apartment down in Asheville. I will take on more tutoring shifts. We can build a normal life. I cannot fight him. You heard him. He will freeze our accounts. He will drag us through a lawsuit for years. He will ruin us." It felt like a physical blow to my ribs. The air rushed out of my lungs. I took a step back from him. The betrayal in that moment eclipsed anything Wallace had just threatened to do. Wallace was acting out of greed, which was predictable. Ian was acting out of cowardice, which was devastating. "You want to surrender?" I asked. My tone dropped, lowering into a quiet, dangerous register. "You want to hand your father the keys to our livelihood so your sister can pay off her credit cards?" "I am trying to protect us," Ian shot back. His defensive posture masked his terror. "It is just dirt, Ruby. It is a piece of real estate. We are what matters. Our marriage is what matters. If we fight him, we lose everything anyway. We lose the land and we end up thousands of dollars in debt to lawyers." I stared at the man I married and I felt a profound, sickening disconnect. He viewed the land as a casualty of war. He thought abandoning it was a strategic retreat. He did not understand the true cost of what he was offering to sacrifice. "It is not just dirt," I told him. My voice remained steady, but the syllables carried the weight of 4 grueling years. "It is my grandmother's vintage watch that I sold to a pawn shop so we could afford fertilizer. It is the 3 times our pipes froze and we melted snow on a camping stove to drink. It is the permanent calluses on my hands. It is the nights you came home dead on your feet because you worked yourself into the ground to buy heating oil." I walked over to the table and rested my fingertips on the leather folder Wallace had left behind. "We paid for this property with our youth and our pain." I continued. "We took a deliberate insult, and we transformed it into a profitable, specialized business. We proved him wrong. And now because your father walked into our kitchen and used a stern voice, you are willing to hand him the spoils of our suffering, just to keep the peace." Ian shook his head. He looked cornered. "You do not know what he is capable of. He warned me. You have never been on the receiving end of his full attention. He will dismantle our lives piece by piece. I am trying to save you from that." "You are not trying to save me," I replied. "You are trying to save yourself from standing up to him." The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. The fundamental crack in our relationship was exposed right there in the open. I realized that Ian had spent his entire life shrinking to avoid his father's wrath, and he was now asking me to shrink alongside him. He was asking me to validate his lifelong submission by folding my own ambitions into his shadow. I could not do it. I refused to let my hard work become a footnote in Chelsea's financial rescue plan. I took a deep breath. I needed to draw a boundary that left 0 room for misinterpretation. I looked directly into his eyes, ensuring he felt the full gravity of my next sentence. "If you sign that paper," I told him, my voice dangerously calm, "you are choosing your abuser over your wife." It was the hardest thing I had ever said to him. It stripped away all the polite excuses and the comforting illusions we used to navigate his family dynamic. It laid the reality of our marriage bare on the kitchen floor. By signing the quitclaim deed, Ian would not be buying our safety. He would be purchasing his father's temporary approval using my blood as the currency. He would be confirming that Wallace owned him. Ian stared at me. His mouth opened, but he could not find the words to defend his position. He saw the cold, immovable truth in my eyes. He realized I would not follow him into a quiet retreat. I would not pack a bag and slip away into the night just to make his life easier. The emotional cost of my ultimatum hit him hard. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. He looked at the legal folder on the table, and then he looked out the window at the terraced slopes we had carved out of the mountain. He was trapped between the terrifying prospect of fighting his creator and the devastating reality of losing his partner. He could not make the choice, not in that moment. The pressure was too immense. Ian turned away from me. He pushed open the back screen door. He walked down the wooden steps and headed straight toward the dense tree line beyond the drying sheds. He walked out into the woods, seeking the only quiet refuge he had left. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the Appalachian canopy. I stood alone in the center of the kitchen. The damp clay Wallace had tracked across our floorboards was drying into a pale dust. The house suddenly felt hollow and unfamiliar. It no longer felt like a shared sanctuary. It felt like a battleground where the opening shots had just been fired. I knew Ian needed time to wrestle with his ghosts. I also knew time was the one resource we no longer possessed. We had less than 72 hours before Wallace initiated a legal siege that would freeze our business accounts and lock us out of our own fields. I could not wait for my husband to find his courage. If we were going to survive this ambush, I had to shift my perspective from defense to strategy. I needed to understand the exact nature of the trap Wallace had set. I walked over to the table, opened the legal folder, and began to read. I did not wait for Ian to find his courage. When the sun came up the next morning, the cabin was silent. Ian was sitting on the edge of our bed staring at the floorboards. He had not slept. I did not try to comfort him, and I did not ask him to come with me. I needed a clear head and a cold strategy. Comforting a man who was preparing to surrender would only dull my focus. I picked up the heavy leather folder Wallace had left on our kitchen table. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door. The drive down the mountain toward Asheville felt different that morning. Usually the winding dirt roads and the dense canopy of trees gave me a sense of deep, quiet security. That morning the trees felt like a barrier trapping me inside a cage someone else owned. I gripped the steering wheel while the morning mist cleared from the windshield. I rehearsed my plan. I knew I needed professional armor to survive the impending siege. I arrived in downtown Asheville just as the city was waking up. I did not seek out a flashy corporate law firm with glass walls and mahogany tables. Those firms catered to men like Wallace. I walked into a modest brick building and found the office of a pragmatic real estate attorney named Harrison. He was a veteran of Appalachian property disputes. He spent his career navigating the brutal intersections where wealthy outside investors collided with local farmers. He was not there to offer emotional support. He was there to dissect the law. I sat across from his scarred wooden desk and handed him the entire stack of documents. I gave him the original property transfer paperwork, the deed, the trust stipulations, and the vague reversion clause Wallace had invoked. I also handed him the operating agreements for my agricultural business. I explained the situation without shedding a single tear. I told him about the ruined cabin, the 4 years of grueling physical labor, the specialized soil preparation, and the lucrative contracts I recently secured with local restaurants. I laid my entire life on his desk and asked him how to defend it. Harrison pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and began to read. He read with a terrifying speed, scanning the dense legal jargon with practiced efficiency. The office was dead quiet, except for the sound of turning pages. I watched his expression, hoping to see a flicker of confidence or a sign that Wallace was overstepping his legal bounds. Instead, I saw Harrison let out a slow, heavy sigh. He closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it. He delivered the reality check I had been dreading since Wallace drove away. Harrison told me that the reversion clause my father-in-law drafted was incredibly broad but legally sound. He explained that the trust specifically deeded the property to Ian for residential purposes. It was meant to be a family dwelling. By leveraging the specific microclimate and running a commercial agricultural enterprise on the land, I had fundamentally altered the nature of the property. I brought in delivery trucks. I installed industrial-grade drip irrigation. I formed an LLC that operated directly on residential trust land. Harrison looked me in the eye and explained the brutal truth. Technically, running a commercial business on a residential trust property gave Wallace the exact standing he needed to trigger the reversion clause. It was a clear breach of the original zoning intent. My arrogant mistake from year one stared me right in the face. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. When we first moved to the mountain, Ian had warned me that his father was setting a trap. Ian knew Wallace would look for any excuse to reclaim the asset once we poured our money into it. I had arrogantly dismissed my husband. I believed my background in botany and my willingness to work until my hands bled would shield us from manipulation. I thought cultivating the earth was a neutral act. I focused entirely on soil acidity and thermal gradients while completely ignoring the administrative vulnerability I was creating. I had failed to secure the proper commercial zoning because I wanted to move fast and prove Wallace wrong. My pride had handed my enemy the exact weapon he needed to destroy me. I leaned forward and asked Harrison what would happen if we fought the reversion. I told him we had established a thriving business and increased the property value. I asked if a judge would recognize our sweat equity and protect our home. Harrison shook his head. He warned me that taking Wallace to court over the deed would be a fatal mistake. If we tried to fight him, Wallace would not just file a standard eviction notice. He would file an emergency injunction against my business. He would claim that my agricultural operations were actively degrading a residential family asset. Harrison laid out this grim sequence of events. A judge would likely grant the temporary injunction while the case slowly wound its way through the courts. That injunction would immediately freeze my business accounts. I would not be able to pay my suppliers. I would be legally barred from harvesting my own crops. The rare truffles and the Appalachian ginseng would rot in the dirt while lawyers argued in air-conditioned rooms. I would breach my contracts with the Michelin-starred chefs in Asheville, destroying my professional reputation. "You will bleed dry in legal fees, Ruby," he stated firmly. "Your father-in-law has the capital to sustain a war of attrition. You do not. If you fight him for the deed, you will lose the business, you will lose your savings, and ultimately, you will lose the land." I sat back in my chair. The walls of the small office felt like they were closing in on me. The sheer injustice of the situation was suffocating. I had poured my soul into that soil. I sacrificed my comfort and strained my marriage to turn a barren slope into a sanctuary. And the law was firmly on the side of the man who merely signed a piece of paper 5 years ago. The legal system did not care about my blisters or Ian grading papers in the freezing dark. It only cared about compliance and zoning intent. I felt a profound, sickening wave of despair. Wallace was going to win. He was going to take the land, sell my infrastructure to the highest bidder, and hand the proceeds to Chelsea. He would erase my identity and use my labor to fund her luxury lifestyle. For a brief, agonizing moment, I considered driving back up the mountain and telling Ian to pack his bags. I considered surrendering. Then my scientific training kicked in. When a biological organism faces a hostile environment that it cannot defeat, it must adapt its strategy to survive. I realized I was focusing my energy on the wrong target. I was treating the physical dirt and the cabin as the prize. But the cabin was just rotting wood, and the dirt was just a medium. The true value was the biological engine I had built on top of it. The true value was the intellectual property, the cultivation methods, and the right to harvest. I stopped looking at the problem like a victim defending a home. I started looking at the problem like a strategist dismantling an asset. If I could not save the habitat, maybe I could insulate the organism. I looked at the thick stack of papers resting under Harrison's hands. I needed to shift my perspective from a defensive posture to an offensive maneuver. I leaned over the desk and asked the attorney a very different question. I asked him what would happen to the business operations if Wallace successfully took the land back. I asked him to separate the physical real estate from the agricultural yield. Harrison stopped talking. The rhythm of his bleak legal lecture halted abruptly. He looked at me with a sudden sharp interest. He adjusted his glasses and stared at the documents with fresh eyes. The dynamic in the small room shifted instantly from a pitying consultation to a tactical planning session. My question had just altered the parameters of the entire battlefield. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the Blue Ridge terrain as I drove back up the gravel incline. My meeting with Harrison had altered my entire understanding of the battlefield. I left Asheville with a distinct tactical path forming in my mind, but a strategy is useless if the Army refuses to march. I knew the real war was not going to be fought in a county courthouse. The real war was waiting for me inside my own home. I pushed open the heavy wooden front door. The interior of the cabin was cool and smelled of wood smoke. I found Ian in our bedroom. He had pulled his old green canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet and placed it on the mattress. He was moving with a frantic, jerky energy. He folded his work shirts and stacked them inside the bag. Next to the shirts sat a plastic bin containing our birth certificates and tax returns. My heart dropped. For a split second I thought the strain had broken him and he was leaving me. But then I saw my own winter coats folded in a pile next to his. He was not abandoning our marriage. He was executing a surrender. He was packing our lives away to hand the cabin over to his father. I stood in the doorway and asked him what he was doing. Ian stopped folding a sweater. His breathing was heavy. He did not look me in the eye. He said we needed to be practical. He told me he was gathering our essential documents so we could leave quickly when the eviction notice arrived. The crisis in our marriage reached its boiling point right there over a canvas bag. Ian raised his voice. Ian never raised his voice. He was a man who navigated life with quiet caution, but fear pushed him over the edge. "I am protecting you from a lawsuit we cannot win," he shouted. His voice cracked with raw desperation. The sound bounced off the log walls. "I am protecting our future Ruby. If we stay here, my father will freeze our bank accounts. He will drag us through a legal hell until we have nothing left. We can rent a place in town. We can start over. I am trying to save us." He expected me to yell back. He braced himself for a screaming match. I did not give him one. Panic feeds on panic, and I had none left to give. I turned around and walked back into the kitchen. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the dining table. This was the table we had salvaged from a local yard sale during our first year on the mountain. We spent an entire weekend sanding away the old cracked varnish and staining the raw wood by hand. It was a physical record of our partnership. I rested my hands on the smooth surface and waited for Ian to follow me. He stepped into the kitchen looking wary. He stood on the opposite side of the table, refusing to sit down. I looked up at him and laid out the stark truth. "Your father does not want this cabin, Ian." Ian frowned and shook his head. He argued that Wallace explicitly demanded the deed. He repeated the threat about residential zoning. I cut him off. I kept my tone low and steady. I told Ian to look out the window at the terraced slopes. "Wallace does not care about the zoning intent of a rotting mountain house," I explained. "He cares about the harvest. He cares about the Michelin restaurant contracts and the specialized truffles we cultivate. Chelsea is facing foreclosure, and your parents are cash poor. They do not want to live in this house. They want to seize the business infrastructure we built and sell it to a commercial developer to pay off her debts." Ian stared at me. The frantic energy began to drain out of his posture. "If you hand him that deed," I continued, "you are not buying our safety. You are funding your sister's luxury lifestyle with the blisters on my hands. If you give him the deed, you validate every cruel thing he has ever done to you. You prove to him that he can treat you like an unpaid servant, and you will simply bow your head and say thank you." The reality of the situation hit Ian like a physical weight. He slowly pulled out a chair and collapsed into it. He rested his elbows on the sanded wood and buried his face in his hands. The emotional cost of the moment was agonizing to witness. This was not a debate about real estate anymore. This was a reckoning with decades of parental abuse. To fight Wallace meant Ian had to sever the final frayed thread connecting him to his mother and father. It meant he had to stop hoping they would one day recognize his worth. It meant accepting the devastating reality that his family viewed him merely as a resource to be harvested. They saw him as livestock. They planted him on a broken piece of land, expected him to fail, and when he miraculously cultivated a thriving business, they arrived to slaughter the calf. Ian sat there with his face hidden in his palms. His shoulders shook in silent grief. He was mourning the parents he deserved but never had. I wanted to reach across the table and hold him. I wanted to tell him everything would be easy. but offering false comfort would ruin the fragile strength he needed to build. He had to face the grief alone. We did not speak for the rest of the evening. The air in the cabin was thick with an unresolved tension. When the sun went down and the mountain temperature dropped, we retreated to separate rooms. Ian took a blanket and lay down on the small sofa in the living room. I went into our bedroom and closed the door. The silence in the cabin that night was louder than any argument we had ever waged. I lay awake staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. I thought about the conversation I had with Harrison, the real estate attorney in Asheville. I had a tactical plan to outmaneuver Wallace. I had a way to sever the value of the dirt from the deed itself. But my plan required the signature of the current property holder. It required my husband to strike the match. I could not force Ian to fight. Dragging a reluctant soldier into battle only guarantees a defeat from within. I had to let him make the choice on his own. He had to wake up the next morning and decide who he was going to be for the rest of his life. He could remain the obedient scapegoat, handing over his dignity to appease a tyrant. Or he could burn the bridge to his toxic past and stand with me to defend the sanctuary we built. The next morning would dictate the survival of our marriage. While Ian slept fitfully on the living room sofa, I sat at the small desk in our bedroom, illuminated only by the harsh glow of my laptop screen. The mountain wind battered the exterior log walls, but inside the cabin, the silence was oppressive. I could hear the faint rhythmic creak of the floorboards whenever Ian shifted his weight. He was wrestling with ghosts I could not fight for him. My battle was happening on a digital screen. I had a narrow tactical window to save my livelihood. I stopped looking for legal loopholes to keep the physical cabin. The consultation with Harrison in Asheville had made the reality brutally clear. Wallace held the high ground regarding the structure itself. The reversion clause was ironclad. If I fought to keep the roof over my head, I would lose the war. I had to let the cabin go. Acknowledging that defeat was a bitter pill to swallow. I had painted those walls and repaired those baseboards. But sentimentality is a fatal flaw in a siege. I needed cold logic. I needed a way to sever the inherent value of the land from the physical dirt itself. I began digging deep into state agricultural statutes and environmental zoning laws. North Carolina has a rich history of protecting its rural farming heritage against aggressive urban expansion. I spent hours reading through dense legislative codes, court precedents, and municipal bylaws. I was searching for a legal mechanism that could detach my business operations from the property deed. I needed a shield that Wallace could not pierce with his high-priced corporate attorneys. I found my weapon buried in an obscure but legally binding section covering agricultural conservation easements. A conservation easement is typically used by large-scale farmers to protect their generational land from industrial development. It is a voluntary legal agreement that permanently restricts how a specific parcel of land can be utilized. Because my limited liability company had already spent years establishing a recognized sustainable heritage farming operation on the acreage, I possessed the specific standing required to invoke this protection. My careful documentation of the rare Appalachian ginseng and the specialized culinary truffles proved that the land was an active, vital agricultural incubator. Furthermore, the steep inclines of the Blue Ridge terrain meant that my terraced farming methods actively prevented soil erosion, qualifying the operation for strict environmental shielding. I read the legal parameters with a growing sense of vindication. By filing a binding operational easement, I could attach my company directly to the soil, regardless of who owned the residential structure sitting on top of it. The easement would permanently restrict the entire 10-acre property. It would legally prohibit any future commercial development. It would forbid clear-cutting the hardwood canopy. It would prevent any unapproved entities from liquidating the existing crops. Most importantly, it would guarantee perpetual access rights for my business. I would have the legally protected authority to drive my trucks up the mountain, maintain my irrigation lines, and harvest my yield indefinitely. The beauty of the easement was its permanence. It ran with the land, not the owner. If Wallace successfully reclaimed the deed through his reversion clause, he would inherit the property with the easement securely attached like a heavy iron chain. It effectively stripped the mountain parcel of its commercial resale value. A luxury real estate developer will not purchase a property if they are legally barred from cutting down the trees or disturbing the soil. Wallace wanted to seize my infrastructure and sell it to the highest bidder to pay off the debts Chelsea accumulated. The easement would poison that well. It would insulate my life work and leave my father-in-law holding a worthless residential deed surrounded by protected farmland he could not touch. He would win the house, but lose the war. I drafted the paperwork using templates provided by the State Agricultural Board. I filled in the precise topographical coordinates, the operational parameters of my business, and the strict limitations placed upon the terrain. I detailed the specific shade requirements for the ginseng and the host tree root systems, vital for the truffle spores, ensuring no judge could ever claim the land could be repurposed without destroying a protected agricultural asset. The hum of our cheap desktop printer, cutting through the quiet night, sounded like the rhythm of a ticking clock. I gathered the warm, freshly printed pages and arranged them into a neat stack. But a brilliant strategy is useless without the authority to execute it. The legal mechanics of the conservation easement contained one crucial bottleneck. To file the document with the county clerk and make the restrictions binding it required the notarized signature of the current property holder. My name was on the business accounts, but the physical deed to the cabin was solely in my husband's name. I needed Ian. I carried the stack of papers out of the bedroom and walked down the short hallway into the kitchen. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The moonlight spilling through the window above the sink cast long, pale shadows across the floor. I placed the legal documents squarely in the center of our refinished dining table. I retrieved a black ink pen from a drawer and set it carefully beside the signature line. I walked to the edge of the living room and looked at Ian. He was wrapped in a woolen blanket, staring blankly at the dark fireplace. He was awake. He knew I was moving around the house. He knew the deadline Wallace set was rapidly approaching. Tomorrow morning marked the third and final day of the ultimatum. I stepped into the room and spoke softly. I did not use a demanding tone. I explained exactly what the documents on the table represented. I told him about the conservation easement, the agricultural protections, and the way it would neutralize his father's threat. I explained that it would cost us the cabin, but it would save our independence. I laid out the strategy with clinical precision, ensuring he understood the power he held in his hands. He did not need to confront his father in a screaming match. He just needed to sign his name. Then I stopped talking. I did not beg him to sign the paper. I did not use guilt or tears to sway his decision. Coercion creates resentment, and I refused to drag a reluctant partner into the future. Ian had to cross this line entirely on his own. He had spent 35 years allowing other people to dictate his actions. He had internalized his father's contempt to the point where he believed he deserved to lose. If he signed the document merely to appease my anger, he would just be trading one master for another. He needed to find his own backbone. He needed to realize that his signature was the only thing standing between our freedom and a lifetime of submission. I turned away from him and walked back toward the kitchen. I stopped near the table and looked back over my shoulder. "The choice is yours," I told him. "The pen is on the table." I returned to our bedroom and closed the door, leaving him alone with his conscience. I lay down on the mattress, but sleep was an impossible luxury. I stared at the dark ceiling and confronted the terrifying reality of my own boundary. I had drawn a line in the sand, and now I had to live with the consequences. I had provided the shield, but he had to be the one to pick it up. If the sun rose and that signature line remained blank, it would mean Ian had finally chosen his fear over our partnership. It would mean Wallace had won. My father-in-law would take the land, sell my business, and use my sweat to fund a failed public relations executive. But the loss of the crops and the soil would pale in comparison to the true casualty of the morning. If Ian did not sign the paperwork by dawn, I knew with stark, chilling certainty that I would pack my bags and walk down the mountain alone. I would be leaving my marriage behind in the rotting cabin. The silence stretched out, pressing against my ears. I listened for the sound of footsteps in the kitchen. I waited for the scratch of a pen against paper. I waited to see if my husband was brave enough to save himself. The gray light of dawn crept over the ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, signaling the arrival of the third day. The deadline. Wallace had given us 72 hours to quietly surrender our livelihood, and the clock was rapidly winding down. I had barely slept. Every creak of the cabin settling in the cold morning air sounded like an approaching engine. I pushed back the heavy quilt and swung my legs out of bed. My bare feet hit the cold floorboards. The defining moment of my marriage was waiting for me on the other side of the bedroom door. I walked down the short hallway, my stomach tight with anticipation and dread. I stepped into the kitchen and stopped. Ian was sitting at the dining table. The overhead light was off. The pale morning sun washed over the rough grain of the wood, illuminating the stack of legal documents I had printed the night before. Ian was holding the black ink pen. He was not writing. He was just gripping the plastic cylinder so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked exhausted. He looked hollowed out, as if a physical weight had been pressing down on his chest for decades and was finally cracking his ribs. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. He had spent the entire night confronting the ghosts of his childhood. He had spent hours wrestling with the deep, ingrained conditioning that demanded he submit to his father. I did not rush toward him. I did not demand an answer. I pulled out the chair next to him and sat down quietly. Ian looked up at me. His expression was a raw, exposed mixture of terror and grief. "If I sign this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I lose them forever. They will never speak to me again." He was not asking a question. He was stating a fact. The words hung in the cold kitchen air, stripped of any polite allusions. Ian understood exactly what the agricultural conservation easement represented. It was not just a clever legal maneuver to protect my crops. It was a formal declaration of war against a man who demanded absolute obedience. By signing his name, Ian would be deliberately sabotaging the financial rescue plan his father had orchestrated for Chelsea. He would be crippling the resale value of a family asset. Wallace would view the action as an unforgivable betrayal. Sylvia would view it as a personal attack on her favorite child. The retaliation would not be measured. It would be an absolute permanent exile from the family. I looked at my husband and I felt a profound aching sadness for the boy who had spent his entire life trying to earn a sliver of affection from people incapable of giving it. I wanted to tell him that his parents would eventually understand. I wanted to promise him that time would heal the rift and that Wallace would respect him for standing his ground. But offering false comfort in a moment of crisis is cruel. I owed him the harsh, unvarnished truth. "I know," I replied, keeping my tone steady and even, "and I am so sorry it has to be this way. But they lost you a long time ago, Ian. You are just making it official." Ian stared at the document. He knew I was right. His family had never truly valued his presence. They had only valued his compliance. They ignored his achievements, mocked his chosen profession as a teacher, and handed him a rotting cabin as a punishment. When he surprisingly turned that punishment into a stable life, they immediately arrived to harvest his success to bail out his reckless sister. They did not view him as a son. They viewed him as a resource. The relationship he was terrified of losing had never actually existed. He was mourning a phantom. This was not a triumphant cinematic moment. There was no sweeping orchestral music playing in the background. There was no sudden burst of defiant energy or heroic speeches. It was a quiet, painful amputation. It was the agonizing process of severing a dead limb to save the rest of the body. Ian lowered his head. He placed the tip of the pen against the signature line at the bottom of the state agricultural form. His hand was shaking slightly. The tremor was visible, transferring a jagged energy into the ink. He took a slow, shuddering breath and signed his name. He formalized the conservation easement. By forming those cursive letters, he chose me. He chose our partnership, our independence, and our future. But the cost of that choice was a permanent, irreconcilable break from his bloodline. He set the pen down. He pushed the folder across the table toward me. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just survived a terrible crash. "Let us go," he said, standing up from the table, "before I change my mind." We did not pack our bags. We did not eat breakfast. I gathered the signed documents, placed them securely into a manila envelope, and grabbed my car keys. We walked out into the crisp mountain air and got into my vehicle. The drive down the steep, winding roads into the county seat was completed in total silence. We did not turn on the radio. Neither of us tried to force conversation. The gravity of what we were about to do required quiet reverence. We arrived at the county clerk office just as the doors unlocked for the business day. The municipal building was a drab utilitarian structure filled with beige tile and humming fluorescent lights. It was an unremarkable setting for a life-altering event. We walked up to the processing counter, and I handed the thick envelope to a clerk wearing a gray cardigan. The clerk pulled the documents out and began reviewing the agricultural conservation easement. She checked the parcel identification numbers, verified the notarized signatures, and scanned the strict operational parameters I had drafted to protect the soil. The process felt agonizingly slow. I watched her read the clauses that permanently restricted commercial development and guaranteed access rights for my business. I watched her verify the legal mechanism that stripped the land of its resale value. She reached for a heavy rubber stamp. She pressed it firmly onto a red ink pad and then slammed it down onto the front page of the easement. The sharp thud echoed through the quiet lobby. "It is filed," the clerk announced, sliding a certified copy back across the counter. "The restrictions are now permanently attached to the deed." Ian stood beside me. As the clerk handed over the paperwork, he exhaled a long, shaky breath. The sound was ragged and uneven. It sounded like a sob that he had managed to trap behind his teeth. He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against his hand for a brief second. The property was legally bound. The invisible barrier was erected around our soil. Wallace could claim the physical cabin, but he could never touch the earth beneath it. He could never sell the terraces to a developer, and he could never liquidate my crops. The trap I designed was fully armed and set. We walked out of the municipal building and stepped into the bright mid-morning sun. We had filed the binding easement just 3 hours before Wallace's ultimatum expired. 3 hours before the deadline that was supposed to mark our surrender. Now all we had to do was drive back up the mountain, pack our personal belongings, and wait for my father-in-law to arrive to claim his hollow victory. We had to prepare ourselves to face the wrath of a predator who did not yet realize he was walking directly into a cage. The silence of the morning was over. The confrontation was inevitable. We returned to the cabin with just a few hours to spare before the deadline. The drive back up the mountain had been a quiet transition from the sterile environment of the county clerk office to the rugged reality of our home. We did not speak much. We simply walked through the front door and began the mechanical process of packing our lives into canvas bags. We only packed our clothing, our personal documents, and a few small mementos. We left the heavy furniture. We left the dishes in the cupboards. We left the specialized farming tools locked securely in the exterior sheds. We were walking away from the physical structure, but we were taking the soul of the operation with us. I zipped my dark green duffel bag shut and carried it out to the front porch. Ian followed a moment later, carrying his own bag and setting it down next to mine on the weathered wooden planks. We sat down on the front steps side by side. The mountain air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was a beautiful, clear afternoon for an eviction. I glanced sideways at Ian. The frantic, nervous energy that had consumed him the night before was gone. The pale exhaustion in his face had settled into a quiet, stoic resolve. He was no longer a man paralyzed by the fear of losing his family. He was a man bracing for the final impact of a collision he had already accepted. He watched the dirt road winding down through the trees, waiting for the inevitable arrival. At exactly 2 p.m, the heavy crunch of tires on gravel shattered the natural quiet of the woods. A sleek, dark, luxury sport utility vehicle navigated the steep incline of our driveway. Behind it trailed a wide, rented commercial moving truck. The convoy looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the wild Appalachian forest. The pristine, glossy paint of the led vehicle gathered a thin layer of brown dust as it rolled toward our clearing. The vehicles came to a slow halt near the edge of the front yard. The engine cut off. The sudden silence that followed felt heavy and charged with impending conflict. The heavy doors of the vehicle swung open. Wallace stepped out first. He wore a crisp, unwrinkled charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place among the towering oak trees. He carried a sleek leather briefcase tucked firmly under his arm. He puffed his chest out and surveyed the property with the arrogant satisfaction of a general claiming a conquered territory. He had forced his son into submission, and he was here to collect the spoils of his victory. Sylvia emerged from the passenger side. My mother-in-law wore a pristine cream-colored trench coat and practical designer flats. She stepped carefully onto the ground, ensuring her shoes avoided the loose soil and damp grass. She treated the rugged landscape like an offensive hazard. Then the back door opened and Chelsea climbed out. Chelsea was facing imminent financial ruin. Her public relations career was destroyed. Her downtown penthouse was slipping into foreclosure due to her own reckless vanity. Yet she arrived at our remote cabin wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a branded paper coffee cup. She looked around the rugged landscape with poorly concealed disgust. She wrinkled her nose as if the natural mountain air offended her sensibilities. She was a bankrupt woman acting like a displaced aristocrat forced to endure a temporary exile. Her entitlement was staggering. She treated her financial rescue like a minor inconvenience she was forced to tolerate. Ian and I stood up from the wooden steps. We stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch with our packed bags sitting visibly by our feet. We presented the exact visual Wallace wanted to see. We looked like a defeated couple ready to surrender the keys and slip away into the shadows. Wallace smirked. It was a cold, triumphant expression. He marched up the dirt path toward the porch, his polished shoes kicking up small clouds of dust. "I see you have finally found some common sense, Ian," he called out. His voice echoed across the quiet clearing. The condescension dripped from every syllable. "It is the smartest thing you have done in years." Sylvia did not even bother to look at us. She treated Ian and me as if we were invisible specters haunting a property she already owned. She walked past the front steps and pointed toward the side of the house. She began gesturing with her hands, mapping out imaginary renovations in the empty air. "We can tear down this old rotting railing," she announced to her daughter, ignoring our presence entirely. "You can build a modern wraparound deck right here, Chelsea. It will be perfect for entertaining guests once we clean up the perimeter and get rid of the mud." Chelsea let out a loud, dramatic sigh. She took a slow sip of her coffee and adjusted her designer sunglasses, staring at the tree line. "God, the smell of dirt is overwhelming out here," she complained, her voice whiny and strained. She turned to her father and pointed a manicured finger toward the back of the property. She pointed directly at the specialized shaded slopes where my rare culinary truffles and native Appalachian ginseng grew. She pointed at the fragile biological incubator that represented 4 years of backbreaking labor and scientific precision. "Dad, how fast can we clear-cut those ugly terraces out back?" she asked. "I want to level that entire hill so we can build the guest house and put in a proper paved driveway." They were discussing my life work like it was a minor landscaping nuisance. They were standing on soil that I had cultivated with my own blistered hands, and they were casually planning to destroy it before the sun went down. The subtext of their conversation was blindingly clear. They viewed Ian and me as nothing more than a brief, failed stewardship of their real estate. We were temporary hired help who had overstayed our welcome. They intended to erase every trace of our existence from the mountain and pave over our struggle with concrete. I felt Ian stiffen beside me. A year ago, he would have flinched. He would have lowered his eyes, swallowed the insult, and internalized the shame. He would have retreated into his own mind to hide from their cruelty. This time, he did not shrink. He stood tall on the wooden planks of the porch. He watched his family perform their toxic routine. He looked at his father holding the briefcase like a weapon. He looked at his mother planning renovations over the ghost of his marriage. He looked at his sister demanding the destruction of a protected ecosystem she did not understand just to soothe her bruised ego. Ian saw them clearly. He did not see them as towering authorities or vital sources of validation. He saw them as shallow, desperate people trapped in a cycle of their own vanity. He watched them plan the demolition of a sanctuary they had no legal right to touch. He realized how small and pathetic their worldview truly was. The fear that had controlled him for 35 years simply evaporated in the crisp mountain air. He did not say a word to stop them. He just stood there and watched them dig their own graves. Wallace marched up the wooden steps of our front porch. The old floorboards groaned beneath his polished leather shoes. He stopped 2 feet away from us and snapped the brass latches of his briefcase open. He did not look at the packed canvas bags resting by our feet. He did not care that we were abandoning our home. He only cared about the paperwork. He reached into the dark interior of his case and pulled out a crisp white document. It was a formal quitclaim deed printed on thick legal paper. He held it out toward my husband. In his other hand, he held an expensive gold pen. "Sign it, Ian," he ordered. His voice was hard and flat. It left zero room for negotiation. "Hand over the keys to the cabin today, and I will not sue your wife for the zoning violations. I will let you both walk away from this mess without a financial penalty." He thought he was being generous. He believed he was offering us a graceful exit from a war we had already lost. He expected Ian to take the gold pen, lower his head, and sign away the last 4 years of our lives just to escape the threat of a courtroom. He used my potential legal ruin as a bargaining chip to force his son into rapid compliance. I did not wait for Ian to reach for the pen. I stepped forward, placing myself directly in front of my father-in-law. I looked at the crisp white quitclaim deed, and then I looked up into his cold, calculating eyes. I remained perfectly calm. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out the heavy brass keys to the cabin. The metal jingled sharply in the quiet mountain air. I extended my hand and dropped the keys straight into his open palm. "You do not need the quitclaim deed," I said smoothly. My voice did not shake. It carried a cool, detached certainty. "You are right, Wallace. We violated the precise terms of the family trust. I ran a commercial agricultural operation on residential land without your explicit permission. It is a clear contractual breach. Therefore, the cabin is yours. It automatically reverts back to your control today. There is no need for a messy legal transfer. We concede the structure." Wallace froze. The gold pen hovered in the air. He frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in deep suspicion. Predators expect their prey to struggle. They expect tears and begging and desperate negotiations. My immediate frictionless surrender confused him. He looked down at the brass keys resting in his palm, and then he looked back at my face. He was searching my expression for a sign of sarcasm or hidden panic. He found nothing but a serene, unbothered calm. He slowly lowered this gold pen and slipped it back into his tailored jacket pocket. His fingers closed tightly around the keys. The initial confusion in his eyes morphed into a dark, smug satisfaction. He believed the threat of endless litigation had terrified me into submission. He assumed I was simply cutting my losses to protect whatever small savings we had left. "Smart girl," Wallace said. A cruel, victorious smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You finally learned when you are beaten. It is a shame you did not learn that lesson 4 years ago. It would have saved you a lot of manual labor." He turned slightly, preparing to call out to Sylvia and Chelsea to tell them the property was secured. He was ready to start measuring the porch for their new luxury renovations. I reached down into the side pocket of my dark green canvas duffel bag. I pulled out a plain manila folder. It was the certified package we had received from the county clerk office just hours earlier. I held it out toward him. However, I continued keeping my tone conversational and light. As the authorized agricultural tenant of this terrain, I filed a different piece of paperwork this morning. This is a binding conservation and operational easement. The county approved it and stamped it onto the public record 3 hours ago. Wallace stopped moving. The smug smile vanished from his lips. He turned back to face me, his eyes darting down to the manila folder. He did not reach for it immediately. He stared at it as if it were a live explosive resting in my hands. He eventually snatched the folder from my grip and flipped the cover open. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal jargon. I watched his gaze lock onto the bright red ink seal from the municipal clerk office, proving the document was a recorded legal fact. "The physical structure of this house is yours, Wallace," I said. "But the soil, the terrace slopes, the irrigation infrastructure, and every single crop growing on this mountain belong exclusively to my limited liability company." The polished veneer of the powerful real estate patriarch cracked and splintered in real time. The color drained from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted rapidly across the paragraphs detailing the permanent restrictions placed upon the dirt. He read the clauses forbidding any future development. He read the sections guaranteeing my perpetual access to the acreage. "What is this?" he snapped. His voice lost its smooth, commanding resonance. It was sharp and laced with a sudden rising panic. He gripped the edges of the folder so hard the thick paper began to crumple. Ian stepped forward. He moved out of my shadow and stood shoulder to shoulder with me on the wooden planks of the porch. When my husband spoke, his voice was surprisingly steady. It was not the fearful, hesitant whisper I had heard in our kitchen the night before. It was the calm, measured tone of a history teacher explaining a simple, inevitable fact to a slow student. "It means," Ian said, looking directly into his father's panicked eyes, "that you own the house. But Ruby owns the rights to the land." Wallace opened his mouth to argue, but Ian did not let him interrupt. Ian held his ground and delivered the rest of the tactical reality with flawless precision. "You cannot develop this property," Ian continued. "You cannot bring in bulldozers to clear-cut the hardwood canopy. You cannot pave a new driveway over the existing root systems. And Chelsea cannot sell it. A residential structure sitting in the middle of a binding agricultural easement with no legal access to its own surrounding acreage is commercially worthless. No developer will touch it. No bank will accept it as collateral. You took the house, but you cannot extract a single dollar of profit from the dirt." The devastating truth hung in the crisp mountain air. Ian had just dismantled his father's entire financial rescue plan. Wallace had intended to seize our profitable farm, sell the infrastructure for a premium, and use the cash to pay off the massive defaulted loans threatening Chelsea. Instead, Wallace was now the proud owner of a rotting log cabin surrounded by 10 acres of protected farmland he was legally forbidden to touch. He could not sell it to save his daughter. He could not even alter the landscaping. He had walked directly into a steel trap, and Ian had just locked the door behind him. I looked past Wallace and focused my attention on my sister-in-law. Chelsea was still standing near the luxury sport utility vehicle. She was holding her branded paper coffee cup and peering at us over the rim of her designer sunglasses. She had no idea what the legal documents meant. She just knew the tone of the conversation had shifted, and her father was suddenly standing on the porch looking like a cornered animal. I offered her a wide, genuine smile. "Enjoy the cabin, Chelsea," I called out. My voice carried easily across the dusty gravel driveway. "We hope you like early mornings. We will be driving our trucks up here every Tuesday at 5 in the morning to harvest our truffles and maintain the irrigation lines. The delivery crews can get a bit loud, but I am sure you will get used to the noise." The silence that descended on the wooden porch was total and profound. It was the kind of quiet that follows a car crash before the sound of sirens begins to wail in the distance. The mountain wind rustled the high canopy of the oak trees, but the three people standing in front of us had stopped breathing. Wallace stared at the manila folder in his hands. He read the state-certified document again. His eyes scanned the exact paragraphs detailing the permanent restrictions placed upon the terrain. He read the clauses forbidding any commercial development and the sections locking the soil into a perpetual agricultural trust. The color of his face changed. The pale shock that had initially drained his features morphed into a dark, dangerous shade of purple. A thick vein throbbed near his temple. The polished veneer of the untouchable real estate tycoon melted away entirely. He was no longer a sophisticated negotiator operating from a position of strength. He was a man who had just realized his own greed had lured him into a steel cage. "This is fraud," Wallace barked. His voice was loud and rough, echoing off the surrounding hills. He shook the folder at us, his hands trembling with unadulterated fury. "You cannot do this. You do not own the property. I will have this torn up in a courtroom before the week is over." I looked at him and kept my tone entirely conversational. I did not raise my voice to match his anger. Speaking softly to a screaming man is the easiest way to prove you hold the power. "You can certainly try," I replied. "But state agricultural protections are ironclad. They were drafted specifically to protect working farmers from predatory outside developers. The county clerk reviewed our operating history and verified our yield. My company has recognized standing. You wanted the deed to the structure, Wallace. You demanded it. Now you have it. The house is yours, but the earth belongs to the business." Down in the gravel driveway, Chelsea finally processed the shifting dynamic. She pulled her designer sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. The arrogant boredom she had displayed just moments earlier vanished. Panic pierced her entitlement. She looked from my face to her father's face and saw the raw, undisguised panic etched into his features. She stepped toward the porch, her expensive leather heels sinking slightly into the damp mountain dust. "Dad, what does this mean?" Chelsea asked. Her voice was shrill and tight. Her hands were shaking so much that coffee spilled over the rim of her branded paper cup and stained the cuff of her silk blouse. She ignored the stain. She pointed a trembling finger at the folder. I need to sell this place today. The bank is calling me every morning. I need the cash to clear my debts. What is she talking about? Wallace turned slowly to look at his daughter. He looked down at the useless piece of paper in his hands. He could not offer her a comforting lie. He could not pull out his leather checkbook and make the problem disappear. The harsh reality of the situation was written in red ink by the municipal clerk. Wallace had orchestrated a hostile takeover of a cash-poor property. He had intended to flip the asset to a boutique developer and use the influx of liquid capital to save Chelsea from her impending foreclosure. Instead, he had successfully sued his own son for a rotting log dwelling that he now possessed a legal obligation to maintain. Because he was the deed holder, he was now responsible for paying the annual property taxes on a parcel of land he could never liquidate. He could not secure a commercial loan against the property because no bank would accept a restricted agricultural parcel as collateral. He had literally stolen a tax liability. Sylvia marched up the wooden steps. She abandoned her careful footing and stomped onto the porch. She grabbed her husband's arm, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of his tailored suit. Her perfect, unbothered facade fractured into a display of naked desperation. "Fix it, Wallace," she demanded. Her tone was sharp and commanding. She was accustomed to her husband bullying his way through every obstacle. "Call your lawyers right now. Tell them to evict her company and clear the title. Fix this mess." Wallace looked at his wife, and the defeat in his eyes was absolute. There was nothing left to fix. The trap was legal binding and permanent. He could hire a dozen expensive attorneys, but they would all read the same statutes I had read. They would tell him that trying to break a state-sanctioned conservation easement would take years of litigation and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees with almost zero chance of success. He was trapped in a financial prison of his own making. The realization hit Chelsea with the force of a falling tree. She dropped her coffee cup. The paper hit the wooden planks, and dark liquid splashed across her expensive shoes. She did not even flinch. She stared at the sagging roof of the cabin and the peeling paint on the window frames. She was bankrupt. She was jobless. She was facing public humiliation in her elite social circles. Her only remaining asset in the entire world was a broken off-grid dwelling in the remote mountains. She was legally forbidden from touching the landscaping. She could not plant a flower garden. She could not cut down a tree to improve the view. She could not build a guest house. She was trapped in the exact poverty she had spent the afternoon mocking. She would have to survive the brutal freezing winters and the failing plumbing with zero income. The golden child had inherited a nightmare. I turned my head and looked at Ian. My husband stood on the porch with his shoulders pulled back and his head held high. He was watching the three people who had tormented him for 3 decades. He watched his father stammer and fail to find a solution. He watched his mother lose her composure and beg for a miracle that was never going to come. He watched his sister confront the terrifying consequences of her own reckless vanity. Ian did not look afraid. The old conditioned terror that used to paralyze him was gone. The invisible chains binding him to their approval snapped and dissolved into the mountain breeze. He looked at his parents, and he no longer saw towering, infallible authorities. He saw them for what they truly were. They were desperate, over-leveraged bullies who relied on intimidation to hide their own incompetence. When their intimidation failed, they had nothing else to offer. They were weak. Ian reached down and picked up his dark green canvas duffel bag. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder. He did not yell at his father. He did not demand an apology for the years of emotional neglect. He realized that demanding an apology from people who lack a conscience is a waste of breath. He simply looked at the man who had tried to ruin his life and offered a single, quiet sentence. "We are done here," Ian said. The finality in his voice was chilling. It was the sound of a heavy iron door slamming shut and locking from the outside. He did not wait for a response. He turned his back on Wallace, Sylvia, and Chelsea. He walked down the wooden steps of the porch, his boots crunching steadily on the gravel driveway. I picked up my own bag and followed him. We walked past the sleek luxury vehicle and the rented moving truck. We did not look back. We walked straight to our modest sedan parked near the edge of the tree line. We opened the doors, tossed our bags into the back seat, and climbed inside. I put the key in the ignition and started the engine. Through the rearview mirror, I could see the three of them standing on the porch of the rotting cabin. They were stranded on an island of their own creation. Wallace was still clutching the useless legal folder. Chelsea had her face buried in her hands. Sylvia was talking frantically, pointing at the surrounding woods as if she could argue with the trees. I shifted the car into gear. We drove down the mountain, leaving them behind in the dust. The road ahead was uncertain, but the air inside the vehicle felt lighter than it had in years. We were driving away from the property, but we were taking our freedom with us. The war was over. We did not ride off into the sunset completely unscathed. Real life rarely offers a seamless cinematic fade to black where the heroes escape without a scratch. The cost of standing our ground and fighting back against my father-in-law was undeniably heavy. We left behind a physical structure we had poured our youth, our savings, and our sweat into. We drove our modest sedan down the winding Appalachian roads, leaving the dense hardwood canopy and the cool mountain air in our rearview mirror. We traded the expansive 10-acre woodland for a cramped rented duplex on the outskirts of Asheville. Our new living space was a severe downgrade in aesthetics. The duplex featured thin walls, peeling linoleum floors, and a small concrete patio that overlooked a busy intersection. There was no romantic fireplace. There was no sweeping view of the valley. Unpacking our canvas duffel bags in that small, sterile living room felt surreal. We had spent 4 years battling the elements to carve a sanctuary out of the brush, and now we were arranging our few remaining possessions in a generic rental unit. The physical transition was jarring, but the air inside those thin drywall partitions felt infinitely lighter. The oppressive atmosphere of impending sabotage and constant judgment was gone. We had traded a beautiful prison for a modest safe haven. Ian spent the first few months navigating a profound and quiet grief. The finality of cutting off his parents was a raw wound that took considerable time to heal. Society often assumes that escaping a toxic family dynamic brings immediate euphoric joy. It rarely does. It usually brings a hollow, aching silence. Ian had to mourn the parents he deserved, but never actually had. He had to accept the devastating reality that his father and mother would never experience a sudden revelation of their own cruelty. There were no tearful apologies waiting in our mailbox. There was no moment of clarity where Wallace realized he valued his son more than his real estate portfolio. Ian woke up many mornings and sat on the edge of our cheap mattress staring at the floorboards. I did not push him to celebrate our tactical victory over the deed. I gave him the quiet space to grieve the permanent amputation of his bloodline. Healing requires you to feel the phantom pain of the severed connection. I watched him process the betrayal, recognizing that his parents only viewed him as a tool to be utilized and discarded. He had to rebuild his entire identity from the ground up without using their validation as a cornerstone. Wallace did not surrender his pride gracefully. His wounded ego demanded retribution for the humiliation he suffered on our front porch. The mail carrier began delivering thick envelopes bearing the return addresses of expensive Charlotte law firms to our duplex. The letters were filled with aggressive legal posturing. The attorneys accused my limited liability company of fraud, breach of contract, and malicious zoning manipulation. They threatened to drag us through the appellate courts until we were bankrupt and broken. We did not panic. We took every single envelope directly to Harrison, our pragmatic real estate attorney in the city. Harrison read the threats and smiled a dry, humorless smile. He drafted a single standardized response citing the ironclad state agricultural statutes that protected our conservation easement. He reminded the high-priced Charlotte lawyers that attempting to dissolve a state-sanctioned agricultural trust without proof of severe ecological degradation was a frivolous endeavor. He informed them that any lawsuit brought against my company would be met with counterclaims for legal harassment. The angry letters quickly hit a dead end. The corporate attorneys realized they were billing a client for a war they could not legally win. They advised Wallace to drop the issue. Wallace was forced to face the bleak reality of his own trap. He had orchestrated a hostile takeover of a cash-poor property, and now he was reaping the bitter rewards of his greed. Because he held the deed to the residential cabin, he was legally obligated to pay the annual property taxes on the entire 10-acre parcel. The county tax assessor evaluated the property and handed him the bill. Wallace was bleeding his depleted cash reserves to maintain ownership of a house he could not liquidate. He could not sell the property to a commercial developer because the binding easement rendered the surrounding acreage commercially useless. No bank would accept a restricted agricultural parcel as collateral for a new loan. He was trapped pouring his money into a rotting asset just to keep the local government from seizing it. The predator had swallowed a poisoned bait, and the venom was draining his bank accounts. Chelsea attempted to inhabit her ill-gotten prize. She moved into the cabin during the mild, late summer weeks. She brought her designer luggage, her expensive coffee habits, and her profound entitlement into a structure that required constant, grueling maintenance. We knew exactly how she was faring because we still drove our delivery trucks up the mountain every Tuesday at 5 a.m. The legal easement guaranteed my business perpetual access to the soil. We would park our work vehicles in the gravel driveway, pull out our digging tools, and walk right past the front porch to harvest our culinary truffles and inspect the irrigation lines. Chelsea would stand behind the screen door, wrapped in heavy luxury blankets, glaring at us. We never spoke to her. We maintained a strict professional detachment. We harvested our yields, loaded our wooden crates into the refrigerated truck, and drove away, leaving her alone in the quiet woods. She treated the mountain like a temporary inconvenience. She expected the environment to adapt to her needs. The mountain broke her in exactly 4 months. When autumn gave way to the brutal Appalachian winter, the reality of off-grid living crushed her fragile facade. Chelsea did not know how to bleed the radiators to keep the furnace running. She did not know how to thaw the ancient copper pipes when the temperature plummeted below freezing. The deep isolation of the woods, the lack of reliable cellular service, and the sheer physical demand of surviving the cold proved too much for a woman accustomed to downtown room service and valet parking. By December, she abandoned the property entirely. She could not handle the freezing nights and the relentless silence. She packed her remaining luxury bags, left the keys on the kitchen counter, and fled back to the city. We heard through mutual acquaintances that she was crashing on a friend's sofa trying to figure out her next move. The cabin was left empty to rot in the snow. Her brief stewardship resulted in nothing but misery and frostbite. The structure began to decay the moment the fires went out. While that touch of karma is undeniably satisfying, the real victory does not reside on the mountain. The true triumph of this entire ordeal lives inside our cramped, rented duplex. Without the crushing burden of his father's expectations, a tremendous weight lifted off Ian's shoulders. The quiet, steady strength I always knew he possessed finally had the room to expand and solidify. He stopped bringing the frantic tension of his childhood into our home. The transformation was slow, but it was remarkable to witness. I watch him now on Sunday mornings. We have a small concrete patio at the back of the duplex, barely large enough to fit 2 folding chairs and a tiny metal table. Ian sits out there, drinking his dark roast coffee and watching the neighborhood traffic roll by. His smartphone rests on the table between us. When the device vibrates, buzzing loudly against the metal, he no longer flinches. He does not brace his body for an incoming verbal assault or a manipulative demand. He simply glances at the screen, sees an unknown Charlotte area code, and ignores it. The conditioned terror that dictated his entire adult life is gone. The invisible strings Wallace used to pull him into submission have been severed permanently. Ian smiles more now. It is a genuine, relaxed smile that reaches the corners of his eyes. He found a new job teaching history at a local high school in Asheville, and he pours his energy into his students instead of trying to earn the approval of ghosts. We lost a piece of real estate, but we kept our marriage and our peace. My agricultural business continues to thrive. Without the financial drain of maintaining a crumbling log cabin, we reinvested our profits into the company. The Michelin restaurant contracts expanded. The pharmaceutical buyers increased their orders for our Appalachian ginseng. We used the steady revenue to build our joint savings account back up. We are currently researching small plots of land down in the valley where we can build a modern greenhouse and scale our operations without any interference. We do not need a sprawling mountain estate to prove our worth to people who never loved us. We built a sanctuary out of strong boundaries, mutual respect, and unyielding truth. Ian finally knows what it feels like to breathe freely without seeking permission from a tyrant. Our life is modest, and our duplex is small, but the walls belong to us. The peace we cultivated in the aftermath of the storm is the most valuable asset we possess, and that sanctuary is entirely our own. Looking back on the freezing nights, the bitter arguments, and the high-stakes legal maneuvers, I realized that survival requires more than just stubborn endurance. It requires a clear strategic vision and a willingness to let go of the things that weigh you down. I have distilled our grueling journey into 5 fundamental lessons that guide how I navigate the world today. Lesson 1. Generosity with hidden conditions is not a gift. It is a transaction designed to purchase your compliance. When someone hands you a liability disguised as a favor, they are setting a trap. True generosity empowers you, while toxic favors are designed to keep you tethered to the person holding the strings. Lesson 2. Hard work alone cannot outmaneuver a bad contract. I believed my blisters and my scientific expertise would protect me from manipulation. I ignored the fine print because I was blinded by pride. You must understand the legal parameters of your battlefield before you pour your soul into the dirt. Passion is vital, but administrative armor is what actually keeps you safe. Lesson 3. Walking away from a toxic bloodline is not a failure. It is a rescue mission. Society places an immense, unjustified pressure on people to forgive their abusers simply because they share DNA. You do not owe your sanity or your future to people who treat you like a disposable resource. Severing the tie is often the only way to save your own life. Lesson 4. True leverage lies in separating the inherent value from the physical asset. Wallace thought the power resided in the house and the deed. I realized the power resided in the knowledge, the operational rights, and the legal protections. When you find yourself backed into a corner, shift your perspective. Look for the invisible mechanisms that control the board. Lesson 5. Peace is the ultimate wealth. We traded 10 acres of pristine mountain real estate for a cramped duplex, and we have never been richer. A mansion filled with anxiety is a prison. A small concrete patio where you can drink your coffee without fear is a kingdom. Never sacrifice your internal sanctuary for external optics. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my journey. If you found value in this story, or if you have ever had to draw a hard line to protect your own peace, please share your experience in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of resilience and survival. This is Eva Tells Stories, reminding you that true freedom begins the moment you stop playing by their rules.